How much can you withdraw from your savings each year in retirement? Well, the answer seems to depend on when you look, and Morningstar recently published some updated research aimed at answering that question. They identified some withdrawal rates that might make sense, or if you prefer to look at it a different way, it helps you estimate how much you might need to save up for retirement if you're going to withdraw at a so-called safe rate. Now, sticking to a rigid withdrawal strategy is not something I see many people do. I don't have any clients doing it. I don't know of any other financial advisors who do it. But still, you can get some valuable insight out of these types of studies, even if you don't follow a withdrawal rate. So let's highlight a couple of those little gems right up front. One takeaway is that the future might look brighter now than it did for somebody retiring a year ago. In other words, you might expect higher returns in the future, although of course there are no guarantees, than you might have a year ago. As a result, you might be able to start with a higher withdrawal rate if you're going to retire in the near future. That's probably not surprising. After a downturn, the expected returns would intuitively be higher going forward. Again, there's no guarantee of anything like that, and the markets will still move up, down, and sideways, and we certainly can't predict exactly when or how fast any returns will materialize. You can still run out of money no matter what strategy you use. Another key finding is that changing your withdrawals even a little bit can help. So that might mean skipping an inflation adjustment or living with less when the markets go down, for example. Ideally, that's a temporary thing, but by taking small steps, you can hopefully avoid more drastic consequences down the road. We'll talk more about all of that, but as a refresher, a withdrawal rate is something designed to help you figure out how much you can sustainably spend over the course of your lifetime without running out of money. The challenge for retirement planning is always that you want to spend enough to enjoy yourself and get your wants and needs met, but at the same time, we don't want you to run out of money before you run out of life. For many people thinking about retirement, those withdrawals might need to last 30 years or maybe more if you retire early. And another way of looking at it is these rates can help you estimate how much you need to save if you back into the calculation. So you might say, if I want to withdraw at a rate that is hopefully sustainable, how much would I need to build up on my retirement date to supplement any other sources of income like Social Security or a pension? So we might look at the traditional 4% rule, which helps to keep the numbers easy. And with that approach, you would multiply the amount you want to withdraw each year by 25, giving you a target amount to have saved at retirement. In other words, if you wanted to withdraw $50,000 per year, you multiply that by 25, and that results in $1.25 million that you would want to have saved up at retirement. But you can also do the calculation a slightly different way. Let's say you want to be more conservative and withdraw 3%. In that case, you would take the amount you want to withdraw each year and divide it by your desired withdrawal rate. So here we would take $50,000, we would divide that by 3% or 0.03, and the result is going to be the amount you need. That's 1.67 million in this case. So the results from Morningstar tell us that the withdrawal rates in the current environment have risen just a bit from where they were about a year ago. So we'll look at each of those rates and go over why they're different and what everything here means. But I'd note that it's interesting how these change over time, and that's kind of a signal that these withdrawal rate strategies should really be nothing more than a rough rule of thumb that you use for estimating. It's really best to do more robust and detailed planning as you get ready for retirement. Again, I don't really use withdrawal rates with clients, and that's because life is kind of hard to fit into a withdrawal rate. So for most people, retirement spending is kind of lumpy and unpredictable. Maybe you need a new car one year, or you have a health care event, or something else comes up. Plus, the data suggests that retirees don't necessarily spend at a rate that matches inflation perfectly, which we'll get into more later, but a traditional withdrawal rate strategy is going to assume that you want to march in lockstep with inflation and keep up with it perfectly. That can put a lot of stress on your portfolio. So instead of using a withdrawal rate, I prefer to look at the big picture with some estimates on market growth and specific cash flows you might need throughout retirement, inflation, taxes, and certain strategies you might use to manage your taxes, and then any healthcare surprises that might come up. Once you start to imagine all of these variable expenses, you can see why a withdrawal rate might be an oversimplification. For example, let's say you're doing a Social Security bridge strategy. That's where you delay claiming Social Security instead of taking it right when you stop working. And that might make sense if you retire in your early 60s because your Social Security benefit grows a little bit for each month that you wait. And that allows you to get more inflation-adjusted, tax-favored, and government-guaranteed income later in life. It can also mean a bigger survivor benefit for a surviving spouse, so it's really an important strategy to consider. You don't need to feel bad if you're going to claim early, but it's definitely worth looking at and seeing if it makes sense. The bridge strategy can also help you spend down some pre-tax savings to hopefully reduce your taxable income later in life. And all the while, you're taking income in years when you have a relatively low income, so you're hopefully in relatively low tax brackets. Ultimately, the strategy might make it so that your required minimum distributions or your RMDs aren't quite as big, which can potentially help you stay in lower tax brackets later in life. And that might also reduce the chances that you have to pay higher Medicare premiums in retirement, which can rise if you have a high income. But to make this strategy work, you need to have sufficient assets to spend, and you need to spend down a significant amount, which can be terrifying. So you want to evaluate the strategy carefully. Ultimately, you might be withdrawing at a relatively high rate in the early years, and then it drops down to a much lower rate later in life. So again, a single withdrawal rate strategy might be an oversimplification. Now back to that Morningstar study, and by the way, you can see the study yourself, which I highly recommend, and there's a link to it in the description. And you'll also find some other resources about retirement planning there in the description, so be sure to check out all of that information. And if you didn't already know, I'm Justin Pritchard, and I help people plan for retirement and invest for the future, and I think you'll get a lot out of those resources, so be sure to check them out. Now, the study assumes a 50-50 portfolio, 50% stocks, 50% in bonds, and a desire to have the money last for at least 30 years with a 90% probability of success. And importantly, the withdrawals are inflation adjusted in most cases. So the amount you withdraw typically increases each year to keep your purchasing power intact over time. That's important for most people because even small amounts of inflation can erode your purchasing power over the decades, and we don't want that. So what changed in the latest version of the study? Well, for starters, they assumed higher stock and bond returns going forward, and inflation was also higher in their assumptions. Of course, these are all assumptions, and they'll ultimately turn out to be wrong, but researchers use their best guesses to figure out how things might unfold in the coming decades. Again, there's no guarantee, so use all of these assumptions at your own risk. For a traditional withdrawal rate, they landed on 3.8%, which is higher than the previous year when it was 3.3%. So you might have heard that the 4% rule is no longer the 4% rule. It was never a rule in the first place. But at this point, Morningstar is calling it potentially 3.8%. They also noted that with this system, you could potentially go down to as low as 30% in stock instead of 50%. Whether or not that's the right thing to do, I'm not sure, but that could be comforting to those of you who are more conservative. As a refresher, the way a withdrawal rate strategy works is you take your starting account balance at retirement and you multiply it by the withdrawal rate you're going to use, and then each year you increase your withdrawals to match inflation. Using some round numbers, let's say you have $1 million saved for retirement. I know some of you have more and many of you have much less, but it's just a nice round number to work with. So let's say you have a 3.8% withdrawal rate here. That would produce $38,000 of withdrawals in the first year. Then, if inflation was 4% over the year, you'd add 4% to your withdrawal for the following year. So in that case, 38,000 times 104% is 39,520. And you just keep repeating this year after year. This approach allows you to keep up with inflation step by step, but it can put some hefty demands on your portfolio. So it might be worth looking at some ways to improve your chances. For example, you might be willing to adjust your spending each year, or you might be willing to take a probability of success that's lower than 90. Or maybe you have no desire to leave any assets to your heirs. So while any withdrawal strategy could mean that you spend down your assets, you'll see that in many cases, these strategies leave you with more money than you started with after 30 years. So that money might not be worth as much as it was in the beginning of your plan, but there's often a cushion in those cases, but there might not be if things don't go favorably. If you end up with nearly twice as much money as you started with, that's not necessarily the worst thing, but it could mean that you ended up missing out on some fulfilling experiences. Maybe you didn't take some vacations, maybe you could have given some money away, something like that. So we want to be intentional as we look at what our strategy is going to be. At the same time, it's very reasonable to set money aside for unknowns because, as we know, healthcare and long-term care in particular can get very expensive, so having that cushion could come in handy. So what might make it possible to withdraw at a rate higher than 3.8%, at least according to this study? Well, the researchers highlighted dynamic strategies as potential solutions. You can see that each strategy here has different characteristics, and all of these characteristics are important as you consider what you want your life to look like. You can see that fixed real approach, which is the standard withdrawal rate, like the so-called 4% rule, now the 3.8% rule. And the term real, by the way, means after inflation. So you receive a fixed amount of inflation-adjusted withdrawals each year. If you go with any of those dynamic strategies, you need to be okay with some unpredictability. So uncertainty can be uncomfortable, but it is reality, and it's probably nothing new to you by this point in your life. So let's start with the foregoing inflation adjustments. In that case, you'd skip your inflation adjustment in years following a loss in your portfolio. That way you withdraw less, and that reduced withdrawal kind of ripples out over all of the subsequent years of your life. That little pause can be really helpful. Next, you have guardrails, and with that system, you give yourself a raise when your investments are doing well, and you reduce your withdrawals when markets go down. So either way, there are going to be rules and limits on how much those withdrawals will increase or decrease, and those limits are the guardrails. This strategy allows you to start with a higher rate, and if all goes well, that's great. But you need to be prepared for the possibility of market downturns and spending cuts in the future. There's also the RMD method. To use this, you withdraw based on your life expectancy. So when you're younger and you have more years to live, hopefully, you withdraw at a lower rate. And as you grow older, you can withdraw at higher rates, so you're taking a bigger percentage of your account each year. This will ultimately result in spending down most of your assets by the time you reach life expectancy, so that's something to keep in mind if you like the idea of leaving a cushion. Next, you have the 10% reduction, and with that option, you start with a traditional withdrawal rate, but you reduce your spending by 10% whenever your investments lose money during a calendar year. Then after your portfolio has a positive year, you get back on track, but it's not entirely clear if that means you go back to where you would have been without the market losses, or if you just resume inflation adjustments based on that reduced amount. Finally, there's the retirement spending smile, which they call the inflation haircut here. And this is based on some research about how retirees actually spend their money, and they don't always follow inflation exactly. It turns out that many people actually spend at roughly inflation minus 1% during their retirement years. So that's what they modeled here. I've got some other videos that discuss that. And if you think about it, maybe you have already paid for your house or you have a fixed rate mortgage that you're not going to change and you're not subject to rent increases, for example. As a retiree, you might not have higher costs, except for healthcare expenses, which typically do inflate at a faster rate, and the retirement spending smile usually takes that into consideration. Ultimately, you can take a lot of pressure off your portfolio if you assume that 1% inflation reduction. There is a lot more to consider here. As just one example, these withdrawal rate strategies don't take taxes into account, but taxes are probably a reality for you, and you won't be able to spend every dollar that you withdraw. So you need to understand how those work. There should be a video popping up right about now that goes over what those taxes are going to be and helps you set some realistic expectations. So check that out. And I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please leave a quick thumbs up. Thank you and take care.